When President Trump announced the reduction in staff at the Social Security Administration, SSA, Tom's retirement plan began to unravel. At 58, Tom had retired from his job as a factory supervisor 2 years ago, expecting to live comfortably off his monthly Social Security payments. But now, that once reliable source of income was being threatened by the government staffing cuts. The simple task of requesting an annual cost of living adjustment to his pension had become a nightmare. For months, Tom had been trying to contact the SSA, navigating through endless waiting times and vague, unhelpful responses. The cuts to SSA staffing meant that every request, including his, was delayed. And the answers he received were increasingly unclear. He was left questioning whether the system he had trusted his entire life could still provide the security he had counted on. As time dragged on, the rising costs of living, groceries, utilities, and healthcare, began to outpace his fixed pension, and Tom felt the pressure building. He had always prided himself on being financially independent, but now, the same system that was meant to support him in his later years seemed to be failing him. His request for an adjustment to his benefits was repeatedly ignored, leaving him unable to keep up with his expenses. The breaking point came when Tom received a letter from the SSA informing him that his request for a cost of living adjustment had been delayed once again. The letter was impersonal and blunt, offering no clear timeline for resolution. Tom could feel his stomach drop as he read it. Despite years of working hard and paying into the system, he now found himself at the mercy of a broken bureaucracy. Tom sat at his worn kitchen table, staring at the letter in disbelief. He had worked tirelessly for decades, had done everything right, but now, at the most vulnerable time of his life, he was left struggling to survive. The letter felt like a cruel reminder that no matter how well he had prepared, the future was no longer certain. In that moment, Tom's mind raced. Could he survive on his current income? Was there a way to make up for the lack of adjustment? What if things didn't improve? For the first time since retiring, Tom felt a deep, unsettling fear about his future. He had assumed that retirement would be a time for rest and stability, but instead, it felt like he was fighting just to keep his head above water. Tom spent the next few days trying to get through to the Social Security Administration. It became his daily ritual, dialing the number, enduring the automated voice, then waiting for what seemed like an eternity before finally hearing the click of a human on the other end. Every time, his hopes would rise, only to be dashed by the vague, often confusing answers they gave. "Thank you for your patience," the automated voice greeted him, followed by a long, drawn-out series of options. "Please press 1 for questions about benefits, press 2 for questions about payments." Tom pressed 1, as he always did, only to be met with an endless loop of music that played in the background. He'd start with the same question, asking about the status of his request for a cost of living adjustment to his Social Security payments. Each time, he was told that there had been a backlog of cases due to staff reductions, and that his request was still being processed. "You will be notified once a decision is made," the voice told him, in its robotic monotone. Tom had heard this phrase so many times it felt like it had been etched into his brain. The worst part? No one seemed to be able to give him an actual answer. He could never speak to the same person twice, and every representative seemed to give him a different response. Some told him his case would be reviewed in a month, others said it could take up to 3 months. And a few even suggested that, given the backlog, there was no telling when, or if, he'd receive the adjustment he desperately needed. After a week of these frustrating calls, Tom felt like he was running out of options. The mailbox held only more official-looking envelopes from SSA, each one more impersonal than the last. It seemed like the more he tried to follow up, the further away the resolution became. He'd sit down at the kitchen table, look at the pile of paperwork, and wonder just how much longer this would go on. One afternoon, as he sat in the dimly lit living room, he received another letter from the SSA. This time, it was an update on his request. He opened it with shaking hands, hoping for some kind of good news, something that would lift his spirits, but as he read the letter, his stomach sank. The language was full of legal jargon, and it essentially told him that they had received his request, but due to staffing shortages, his case would be delayed once again. There was no new information, no timeline for when it might be resolved. Just a formal, cold statement that seemed to dismiss his urgency entirely. Tom slammed the letter down on the table. It was another blow to his already fragile sense of security. He had worked hard for this, he had paid into the system for decades, and now, at the point in his life when he should be enjoying some peace and stability, he was faced with endless delays, inefficiency, and a government bureaucracy that seemed uninterested in meeting his needs. How much longer am I supposed to wait? He muttered to himself. How much longer until I have to make some impossible choice? He stood up, feeling a wave of frustration wash over him. His life had been built on the idea that, when the time came, Social Security would be there to help him through his retirement years. But now, the longer he waited, the more uncertain his future became. The rising costs of living were no longer something he could ignore, and every day without a clear answer from SSA felt like a ticking clock, reminding him of how little time he had left to make ends meet. The decision to request an adjustment had been simple in theory, just a routine process, but now, it felt like a monumental challenge, one that was unraveling his sense of security, piece by piece. In the end, Tom knew that he could only wait so long before the pressure of this bureaucratic nightmare would force him to take action. But for now, he was stuck, tangled in the endless web of delays and frustrations. And with each passing day, the financial burden grew heavier, making the road ahead seem even more uncertain. As the weeks dragged on, the weight of Tom's financial struggles became more apparent. His phone calls to the Social Security Administration were met with more delays, and the letters he received in return were nothing more than vague reassurances that his request was still under review. Each day, it felt like he was waiting for a lifeline that was never going to come. Tom had always been a proud man, one who believed in working hard and saving for his future. He had spent his entire life building a stable foundation, and yet now, in retirement, he found himself staring at a mountain of bills that seemed to grow taller every month. The pension he had relied on for so long was no longer enough to cover his needs. The most pressing issue was the increasing cost of everything around him. Groceries, utilities, and healthcare were steadily rising, but his Social Security payments remained the same. Every time he went to the store, it seemed like the prices of basic necessities had increased, and his fixed income just wasn't keeping up. Tom had already cut back on luxuries, like dining out or attending the occasional movie, but now, he was beginning to question whether he could even afford the essentials. One evening, as Tom sat at his kitchen table, he went over his finances again. He pulled out the same old budget sheet he had used for years, but now it was barely accurate. It didn't account for the rising costs of healthcare or the small, yet significant, increases in daily expenses. He stared at the numbers, feeling the panic begin to rise in his chest. The electricity bill was due, and though it wasn't much, every dollar felt precious. He had already cut back on using the air conditioning and had started turning off lights the moment they weren't needed, but it still wasn't enough. Tom tried to ignore the pangs of guilt that hit him every time he glanced at the bill, but deep down, he knew the writing was on the wall. He couldn't keep up forever, and then there was the matter of his car. Tom had bought it years ago, and while it was reliable, it was getting old. The check engine light had come on recently, and he had a sinking feeling that a big repair was looming. The thought of paying for the repairs filled him with dread. His pension didn't stretch far enough to cover unexpected costs like that. The car had always been a lifeline for him. He relied on it to get to the doctor's office, buy groceries, and attend community events. If it broke down completely, his already fragile sense of independence would shatter. Tom could feel his frustration building. He had always prided himself on being independent, on providing for himself. But now, it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. He didn't want to ask his daughter for help. Megan had her own life to live, and he didn't want to burden her with his problems. Still, the thought of asking for help, even if it was just a loan, began to creep into his mind more and more, as he sat in the quiet of his apartment. Tom thought back to the days when retirement had seemed like a dream. He had imagined enjoying long, relaxing days, no more alarms, no more deadlines, just time to enjoy life. But instead, he had traded that dream for an endless struggle to make ends meet. The adjustments he had been promised seemed like a distant hope, and with every passing day, that hope was beginning to feel more like a cruel joke. His mind wandered back to the stack of overdue bills on the counter. Each one seemed to mock him, a reminder of how much further behind he had fallen. Tom's stomach tightened as he thought about the future. How much longer could he keep pretending that everything would be fine? He had always been able to manage before, but now, he couldn't see the way out. It was the night before the rent was due, and Tom felt the familiar knot of anxiety settle in his chest. He had scraped together what he could, but it wasn't enough. The landlord had been patient with him, but there was a limit to that patience. Tom knew that if he didn't come up with the rest of the rent soon, he would face eviction. The thought of packing up his life, leaving behind everything he had worked for, was terrifying. But at that moment, it felt like the only option left. His phone buzzed on the table, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Megan. "Hey Dad, just checking in. Is everything okay?" Tom stared at the screen for a moment. He thought about telling her the truth, about explaining just how dire things had become. But then he thought about how much she already had on her plate. She was busy with her own family, trying to make a living, and he didn't want to drag her into his mess. So instead, he typed back, "Yeah, everything's fine. Just a lot going on. I'll talk to you soon." He set the phone down and sighed deeply, his head resting in his hands. The weight of it all, the financial strain, the deteriorating health, the fear of eviction, it was too much to bear alone. But as he sat there, alone in his apartment, he realized that he didn't know how much longer he could keep this up. The road ahead felt like an endless series of obstacles, each one more daunting than the last. But in that moment, Tom made a silent promise to himself. No matter how bad it got, he wasn't going to give up. He would find a way to keep going, even if it meant asking for help. But for now, all he could do was wait for the next letter, the next phone call, and hope that the system that had promised him security would finally come through. Tom sat at the small kitchen table, the yellowed paper of his medical bills staring up at him. The costs of healthcare, once manageable in his younger years, now loomed like an insurmountable mountain. He had always taken good care of his health, regularly seeing doctors for checkups and staying active. But now, at 58, his health issues had become more frequent, more urgent. His heart, which had been his steadfast companion for all these years, was starting to betray him. It had been a few months since he last saw his cardiologist. The doctor's bills, too, had been piling up, along with the prescription copays that seemed to increase every year. Tom had always been one to prioritize his health. But now even simple visits to the doctor felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. His heart had been weak for a while, but the real problem was his age. With each passing year, the chances of complications grew, and the medications to manage it grew more expensive. He ran a hand through his thinning gray hair, the weight of his situation heavy on his chest. He hadn't been to the doctor in over 2 months. Every time he thought about scheduling an appointment, the same question crept into his mind: could he afford it? Tom had already cut back on visits, opting instead to rely on the few prescriptions he had left from his last visit, hoping that it would be enough to hold him over. But now, with the pressure of rent looming and the constant dread of eviction hanging over him, he had started skipping doses of his medication, telling himself he would take them when things calmed down. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the solution. Skipping doses would only worsen his condition. Yet, it felt like the only option when everything else seemed out of his control. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was another call from the Social Security Administration, but this time, it was a recorded message rather than a live person. It was the same monotonous, mechanical voice that he had grown accustomed to hearing. "Thank you for your patience. We are currently experiencing delays due to staffing shortages," the voice said, like it was reading from a script. "Please continue to hold for your next available representative." Tom felt his stomach churn. Every call to SSA seemed like a futile exercise, one that drained him more with each passing day. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being ignored, his needs and concerns dismissed by a system overwhelmed by bureaucracy. The frustration was like a constant knot in his gut. He had tried reaching out to his daughter, Megan, again, but the thought of burdening her further with his struggles kept him from picking up the phone. He knew she had her own family and bills to worry about. He didn't want her to see him as weak or unable to handle his own problems. He had always been the one to take care of her, to provide when she needed it. But now, in his retirement, he was the one who needed help, and it made him feel powerless, but Tom couldn't escape the reality any longer. His heart was getting worse, his finances were dwindling, and the weight of it all was becoming unbearable. He had always believed that retirement would be a time for rest. A time for enjoyment after decades of hard work. But now, it felt like he was in the midst of a never-ending struggle. Later that evening, as he prepared a simple dinner of soup and bread, Tom thought about the last time he'd felt truly in control of his life. It seemed like a lifetime ago, when he was working, contributing, and had everything mapped out for the future. Now, his world felt uncertain, like a ship caught in a storm with no clear direction. He stared at the clock on the wall, watching the minutes tick by, and felt a deep sense of dread. What if he didn't make it through this? What if the system failed him completely, and he was left with nothing? The thought gnawed at him, but he quickly pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to think like that. He had to keep going, even if it meant fighting an uphill battle every step of the way. As Tom ate his dinner in silence, he knew he couldn't keep going at this pace. His body was telling him he needed help. His finances were telling him the same thing. But asking for help, actually admitting that he couldn't do it all on his own, felt like the hardest thing of all. Tom awoke that morning with a feeling he had never experienced before. It wasn't just the usual ache in his bones, the stiffness in his joints, or the pressure in his chest that came with the territory of getting older. No, today felt different. Today, it felt like he had reached a breaking point. The weight of everything had become unbearable, the stack of bills, unopened letters from the SSA, the rent reminder, the overdue medical bills, all of them sat on his kitchen counter like reminders of a future he didn't want to face. Every time he reached for the coffee cup, his hand trembled, the act of pouring it felt mechanical. Even the warmth of the morning sunlight that usually gave him a sense of peace felt distant today. He had been going through the motions for the past few months, trying to get by with what he had left, but now, everything seemed to be spiraling. The daily stress of living on a fixed income, the constant worry about his health, and the deepening hole he was in emotionally and financially had drained him in ways he couldn't describe. Today, the future didn't look like something he could take control of anymore. The reality that he could lose his apartment, his access to healthcare, and even his independence had begun to settle in his mind. He had tried to convince himself that things would improve, that the Social Security Administration would eventually get around to his request for an adjustment. That somehow his health would stabilize, but all those thoughts felt empty now. He had no certainty. For the first time, Tom thought about something he had pushed aside for months, the idea of asking for help, really asking for help, not just a few dollars from his daughter, but a real lifeline. The thought of going to a financial advisor, or worse, a lawyer to fight for his pension increase, felt overwhelming. The reality was that Tom wasn't the man he used to be. The proud man who had lived independently, providing for himself and his family, was now facing the harsh truth that he couldn't do it all on his own. The phone rang, snapping him from his thoughts. Tom had been ignoring calls all morning, but this one came from Megan. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice light but laced with concern. "I was just checking in on you. How are you doing?" Tom stared at the phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. How could he tell her the truth? How could he admit that everything was falling apart? That the man who had always been there for her, who had taught her to stand on her own 2 feet, was now struggling to stay afloat. He took a deep breath before answering, trying to steady his voice. "I'm fine, Meg. Just trying to get through the day, you know." Megan wasn't fooled. "Dad, you don't sound fine. I can hear it in your voice. What's going on? Are you okay?" Tom hesitated. He didn't want to burden her, didn't want her to see him as weak. But this was the moment he had been dreading, when he would have to admit just how bad things had gotten. He swallowed hard and spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Megan. I'm not okay. I've been trying to make ends meet, but it's getting harder and harder. The rent's due, my health is getting worse, and I can't get the help I need from SSA. I don't know how much longer I can keep going like this." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Tom could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on him. "I don't know what to do, Meg," he continued, his voice cracking. "I'm stuck. And I don't want to drag you into this." Megan's voice softened, and Tom could hear the pain in her words. "Dad, you're not dragging me into anything. I'm your daughter. We're a team. You don't have to go through this alone." Her words were like a balm to his frayed nerves. He knew, deep down, that she was right, but the pride he had held onto for so many years made it hard to reach out. But now, as he sat there, feeling completely overwhelmed, Tom realized that maybe it was time to stop pretending he had it all under control. Maybe it was time to accept the help he so desperately needed. "I've been afraid, Meg. Afraid to admit that I can't do this anymore," he said softly. "You don't have to do this alone, Dad," she replied firmly. "We'll figure it out together. But you have to let me help." Tom's heart swelled with gratitude and guilt at the same time. He had always been the one to help, to protect his family, but now he was the one who needed saving. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for being there. I don't know what I'd do without you." Megan's reassurance was the first real comfort he had felt in weeks. It wasn't a solution, not yet, but it was a step toward finding one. Tom knew the road ahead would still be difficult, there were no guarantees. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could survive this. With Megan by his side, and with the weight of his struggles now shared, he could face the uncertainty of the future. The days after Tom's conversation with Megan felt different, as though a heavy cloud had momentarily lifted from his shoulders. He had never been good at asking for help. It wasn't that he didn't want it, but the thought of leaning on others, especially his daughter, had always felt like a last resort. But now, with Megan's reassurance, Tom began to realize that he wasn't weak for needing help. He was simply human. Megan had insisted that they take immediate action. "Dad, we need to get a plan in place," she had said. "We'll figure out what's going on with your pension request, and I'll help you look into other options." The very next day, Megan scheduled an appointment with a financial advisor for Tom. She found someone local who specialized in retirement planning for people in difficult situations. At first, Tom hesitated. He felt overwhelmed by the idea of diving into a new set of financial options, but Megan had been persistent, telling him, "We need to face this head-on. You've done everything you could, but now we need to see what else is out there." It was a strange feeling, sitting in a clean, professional office, with someone who wasn't a friend or family member, yet still concerned about his future. The financial advisor, a calm woman in her 40s named Linda, reviewed Tom's situation thoroughly. She looked over the bills he had accumulated, the notices from SSA, and his pension plan. Nodding thoughtfully as she processed the information, "Tom," Linda said after a long pause, "it's clear you've been managing as best you can. But it's also clear that your financial situation isn't sustainable with the current income you're receiving, especially given your health." Tom swallowed hard, hearing the truth of it spoken out loud. "So, what do I do?" he asked, his voice strained. Linda smiled reassuringly, sensing his anxiety. "First, we'll work on a strategy to manage your current expenses. We'll also look into ways to make sure you get the help you need from Social Security, even if that means taking further steps, whether it's reaching out to a legal aid service to push the SSA on their delays, or finding temporary financial assistance programs that you qualify for." Tom sat up a little straighter. For the first time in months, he felt like someone was actively fighting for him, helping him navigate the bureaucratic nightmare that had plagued him for so long. They discussed various options, cutting back on unnecessary expenses, setting up a more manageable budget, and even considering supplemental income sources. Tom's eyes widened when Linda suggested looking into local community programs for seniors, which offered financial assistance for rent and utilities. "You're not alone in this, Tom," she said. "There are programs that can help, and we'll find them." But what really struck Tom was when Linda spoke about his pension. She suggested that he could apply for a supplemental insurance policy for medical costs that would help cover his doctor's visits and prescriptions, reducing the financial burden. It's not a quick fix, but it could alleviate some pressure and give you some breathing room. He left the meeting feeling exhausted, yet something had shifted inside him. The weight on his chest felt a little lighter. There were still plenty of challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, Tom felt like he had a fighting chance. He wasn't just floating in the dark anymore, there was a plan, a way forward. That evening, as Tom sat in his worn recliner, he thought about how different things had felt just a few days ago. He had felt trapped, powerless, unsure if he could keep going. But now, the future no longer seemed as bleak. It was still uncertain, but it wasn't the terrifying unknown it had been before. There was hope, even if it was small. Later that night, after finishing a simple dinner of soup and toast, Tom called Megan to update her on the meeting. She listened patiently as he shared what they had discussed, her voice filled with encouragement. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she said, her tone warm. "You're not just surviving this anymore, you're taking control. We're going to get through this together." Hearing her words gave Tom a renewed sense of determination. He had always been independent, and though asking for help had been hard, he realized that he wasn't losing his independence by accepting it. He was simply learning to adapt, to survive in a world that wasn't as predictable as it used to be. The next morning, Tom woke up with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in months. He had a new list of things to do, starting with organizing his finances, reaching out to SSA once again, and applying for the community assistance programs Linda had mentioned. There was a path forward, and Tom was determined to walk it, no matter how difficult the journey ahead might be. For the first time in a long time, Tom believed that maybe, just maybe, things would get better. Tom had always prided himself on his independence. Even as a young man, he had worked hard to ensure that his family was provided for, and in his retirement, he had hoped to enjoy the fruits of those years of labor. But now, sitting in his modest apartment, looking at the calendar with rent due and the ever-growing pile of bills on the kitchen table, he realized that his independence had come at a cost. It wasn't just the physical strain of managing health problems, it was the emotional toll of facing a financial crisis that he couldn't solve on his own. Despite the professional advice and Megan's constant encouragement, Tom still found himself on the brink of a difficult decision. The Social Security Administration still hadn't processed his cost of living adjustment request, and the money he had managed to scrape together from various sources was running out. He had applied for assistance programs and had sent in a request for expedited handling of his case, but there was still no guarantee of when, or if, he would see the help he so desperately needed. Tom had never been one to sit idly by when there was a problem to solve. But now, each solution seemed like a temporary fix, a band-aid on a wound that kept bleeding. His mind kept returning to the possibility that he might lose his apartment. The rent was overdue, and while his landlord had been understanding, he couldn't keep waiting forever. If he didn't come up with the full payment by the end of the week, he would be evicted. And then what? That morning, as he sat down at the kitchen table with his coffee, Tom made a decision. He couldn't let his fear dictate his actions anymore. His pride, his need to appear strong for Megan, had kept him from fully opening up to her about how deep the hole had become. But if there was one thing that had become clear over the past few weeks, it was that his family was there for him. Megan wanted to help, and Tom realized that he had to let her. He picked up the phone, his hand shaking as he dialed her number. This time, there was no hesitation, no beating around the bush. He needed help, real help, not just a loan or a quick fix. He needed her to be involved in a way that was bigger than just offering moral support. "Megan, it's Dad," he said when she answered, his voice tight but steady. "I need to talk to you about something serious." There was a pause before Megan spoke, concern evident in her tone. "Dad, what's going on? Are you okay?" Tom took a deep breath. "I'm not okay, Meg. I've tried to handle this on my own, but it's too much. I'm behind on the rent, I haven't gotten the Social Security adjustment, and I'm scared I'm going to lose my home. I don't know what to do." There was a long silence, and Tom could hear Megan taking in his words, her own thoughts processing. Then, finally, she spoke. "Dad, I've been worried about you for a while now. You don't have to do this alone. I'm here for you. Let's figure this out together." Her words felt like a weight had been lifted from his chest. He had known she would help, but hearing it out loud made it real. She wasn't just offering financial help, she was offering something far more important: partnership. She would stand by him through this, just like she always had. Tom let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thank you, Meg. I don't know how I let myself get so far into this." "You don't have to apologize. We'll get through this. We'll make a plan. I'll come over this weekend, and we'll sit down and go through everything, see where we can cut costs. And how I can help with the rent. I know things are tough, but you don't have to carry this alone anymore." Tom wiped a tear from his eye, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. It had taken him too long to admit that he needed help, but now, with Megan's support, he could breathe again. The fear that had been gripping him for weeks started to loosen its hold. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he said softly. "Don't worry about it, Dad," Megan replied. "We're a team. Always have been, always will be." As the call ended, Tom sat back in his chair, his heart a little lighter. He wasn't out of the woods yet, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. He had a plan, something concrete to work toward, and a family that was behind him every step of the way. Tom knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Megan's help, he had hope again. For the first time in months, he saw a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going.